Hello, my name is Durwood Shepard, and welcome to this webinar covering updates to the 2020 FDOT Design Manual, Chapter 215 on roadside safety. The first update I'm going to cover is a modification to how clear zone is represented in the department's design criteria. Previously, the clear zone section was titled Clear Zone Criteria, which implied that the definition and accompanying slope classifications could be used as a minimum criteria for establishing roadside slopes during design. However, the intent of the narrative included in the section was provided for supporting information and background to designers about what constitutes a recoverable and traversable roadside slope. Therefore, this section was retitled to Clear Zone Concept instead of Criteria, and language was added to ensure the reader knows what the department's roadside slope criteria is and how it is superseded in subsequent sections of Chapter 215. To further the point that slope classifications for clear zone are not minimum criteria, Figure 215 2.2, the clear zone concept figure, and Figure 215.2.3, the adjusted clear zone concept, were modified to remove the slope ratio callouts along the various portions of the clear zone width. Another improvement was relocating the roadside slope criteria table, Table 215.2.3, to within the body of the text. As you can see here, the table fell after the RR criteria section, although the table actually applies to the introductory section of the overall roadside slope criteria. As you can see here in the 2020 update, the table has now been relocated to ensure that it is not confused with the RR criteria. Our next change deals with the removal of modified thrive beam as an option for longitudinal semi-rigid barriers from the standards. The barrier option has been removed from the guardrail standard plans, Index 536001, because it does not meet the desired crash testing performance level under the new MASH crash testing standards. As can be seen in the original text, modified thrive beam was previously compliant to NCHRP 350 crash testing standards as TL4, which includes testing with a large single unit truck. However, under the MASH crash testing standards, the system is only compliant to TL3, and therefore there is no significant benefit to the additional cost over standard WB. Section 215.413, covering rigid barriers, was also updated to include a reference to the standard plan's instructions for Index 521001. This includes maximum taper rate information for concrete barriers and traffic railings. The reference was added to let designers know where the information is located so that it can be applied to all of the various rigid barriers covered by FDOT standards, not just concrete barriers included in Index 521001. A reference to FDM Chapter 240 has been added to the narrative on covering the placement of temporary barriers. FDM 240 now includes additional information about consideration for placement of barriers when accommodating bicycle and pedestrian traffic through work zones. Please refer to FDM 240 for additional information. The department's policy on guardrail end treatments was also revised as a result of implementing MASH compliant crash tested approach terminals. This change makes permanent the removal of flared terminals as an option for W-beam guardrail approach terminals. We have also updated the section to better describe the policy for use by test level and connection type. For examples, TL2 for design speeds less than or equal to 45 miles per hour, or TL3, which can be used for all design speeds. We also adjusted this for connection type to show the difference between a single-faced and a double-faced approach terminal. Please review Roadway Design Bulletin 18-02 for additional information about the use of flared approach terminals. The next section covers crash cushions. For the best possible performance, it has been a department policy to not locate crash cushions in combination with curbs. That is, do not locate curbs adjacent to or in advance of a crash cushion. However, there are many cases within urban areas where curb is present that crash cushions would still provide the best possible solution for shielding hazards with the greatest length of need possible. Therefore, the policy has been relaxed to allow crash cushions to be used in combination with curb within constrained conditions. The next change we'll cover is a modification to the barrier offset policy for W-beam guardrail. For consistency of installation and to ensure that installations of W-beam guardrail perform as intended, the department adopted offset criteria which places the face of guardrail 2 feet beyond the full shoulder width, not to exceed 12 feet. However, there are frequent cases where locating the guardrail at this location conflicts with buried utilities or structures, and therefore either a substantial amount of alternative post types, such as encased shallow post or special anchor base plate mounted post, or the offset would have to be adjusted. In many cases, additional offset of the guardrail would be the best solution, provided the appropriate grading in advance of the barrier can be provided. Therefore, this section has been modified to acknowledge that allowable additional offset. Within barrier offsets, we also provided additional guidance for the placement of rigid barriers. As opposed to W-beam guardrail, no specific offset values are provided for rigid barriers. This is because the predominant use of rigid barriers is for locations where high crash performance is desired, for example, bridges, or where the deflection of a flexible or semi-rigid barrier are not feasible, for example, narrow medians. As with all barriers, it is important that rigid barriers be offset from traffic at a distance where it can perform as intended. And for rigid barriers, terrain effects can have a significant impact. Therefore, the additional language was added to ensure rigid barriers are installed in close proximity to traffic while providing full shoulder width and providing for a paved surface all the way to the face of the barrier. Finally, in barrier offsets, a clarification was added to define setback, which is the distance from the face of the barrier to an above ground hazard. It was also clarified in this section that the setback requirements must be met even for breakaway devices located behind a barrier. This is important because the interaction between the barrier and the breakaway device would likely result in one of the two not performing as intended. Within the length of needs section of Chapter 215, several additions were made to accommodate common situations for which the department policy was previously silent. This includes 3 primary additions. First is an acknowledgement that RRR clear zone criteria can be used for evaluating the length of need of barriers shielding existing hazards. The second is an allowance of the barrier installations where the length of need is restricted by a project constraint, such as a driveway, canal, or railway. And finally, the third addition is a reference to the standard plans instructions for Index 521.001, which includes a method for determining the trailing end length of need for rigid barriers. Section 215.4.7, warrants for roadside barrier, was also updated to acknowledge that hazards meeting the minimum lateral offset criteria for Section 215.2.4 do not require shielding. Also, we clarified that the list of predefined hazards which are considered more hazardous than roadside barriers do not require an RSAP or HSM analysis. Existing installation of guardrail are allowed to remain in place as long as it meets the requirements of the 2013 design standards, which was the last version of the guardrail standards before adopting the MASH compliant 31-inch guardrail standards. This policy remains unchanged since 2014. However, we did want to clarify that this also includes the length of need as previously determined prior to the 2017-18 design standards Index 400. The final change we'll cover today is a clarification of the non-standard roadside safety hardware policy. This policy requires all roadside safety devices not covered by the approved products list, not detailed in accordance with the standard plans, or not used in accordance with the intended applications to be approved for use by the State Roadway Design Office. This concludes this presentation of the updates to FDM 215. Thank you and have a great day.